I was 21 years old when this happened. It was the winter break during my last year of college, and for reasons that I won't get into, I wasn't going back to visit my family. All of my roommates had gone, but I had a vacation planned with my friend Pat. We were in Arizona, so even though it was winter, it wasn't like the freezing, snowy kind of winter you'd expect in other places. It was just cold enough to need a jacket, but nothing too extreme. Pat and I wanted to get away, and we didn't feel like doing the usual hotel thing, so we found a small house to rent for a week. It was in a quiet residential neighborhood, which we liked since we didn't want to be in the middle of a tourist area. I booked the whole trip on Airbnb and chose the place myself. Pat was fine with letting me do that. The place was basically a small apartment on the main floor of the house. There was an upstairs unit, but we didn't know if it was rented out to anyone at the time. I just noticed the listing when I was booking ours. The listing didn't mention anything about shared spaces, so we assumed it wouldn't be an issue. It looked like an ordinary house, but we liked that it had its own little kitchen and living room. We didn't know much about the owner, other than he seemed fine in the messages we exchanged before arriving. I got up early in the morning on a Monday in December, and Pat picked me up at my house. It was about a 3-hour drive, so we arrived while it was still early. The owner gave us a code for the lock on the front door and said to just let ourselves in. It seemed like a pretty normal setup, so we didn't have any concerns. We were just looking forward to a low-key vacation. When we arrived, we didn't see the owner at all. We punched in the code, got in without any issues, and started checking the place out. The outside of the house looked a little worn down. Not terrible, but kind of old. The inside, though, it was completely redone. It was modern and clean with new appliances, fresh paint, and everything seemed well kept. We were actually surprised, considering the outside didn't give us the best first impression. There was one part of the house that didn't quite fit with the rest. Right under the staircase that led to the upstairs unit was an old locked door. It looked like it had been there since the house was built. I figured it led to the basement because of its location, but since it was locked, we didn't bother messing with it. We assumed it was just an area for storage. That evening, we made some dinner and relaxed. It was nice to just sit back and enjoy the space. At around sunset, we were sitting in the living room talking with the TV on. Suddenly, I noticed a car pull up on the street in front of the house. It parked a few car lengths away, but the headlights shone right into our front window. Then in an instant, they shut off. It caught our attention, but I wasn't worried in any serious way. I went over to the window and looked out. A guy got out of the car, but he didn't come up to the door or anything. I thought maybe he was visiting one of the neighbors, or maybe the upstairs unit was rented out after all. Either way, it didn't seem worth worrying about. A few minutes later, I got up to get a drink, and I walked by the side door, which had a window on it. I saw a man standing there in the alley between our house and the next door neighbor. I think it was the man from the car, but still it didn't seem that weird. For all I knew, he could have been living in the other house. Nothing else happened after that, and we soon went to bed. Sometime during the night, I woke up, but I was still half asleep. I tossed and turned a bit, but then opened my eyes all the way. There was a man standing right next to the bed, just looking at me. I froze for a second, then instinctively gasped. As soon as I did, the guy bolted out of the room. I could hear him running down the hall, and then I heard the basement door slam shut, and someone locked it too. I immediately woke up Pat, who was still out cold. We were both freaked out, so I grabbed my phone and called the cops. They got there pretty quickly, and when they searched the house, they didn't find anyone. But they did check the basement, which had a separate entrance from the outside. That's how they figured the guy must have snuck in. The cops didn't see any signs of forced entry, so either he had a key, or he found some way to break in without leaving a trace. The owner was notified, and he acted surprised when I talked to him. But Pat and I had our suspicions. Either the guy had some connection to the owner, or maybe he was a former guest who managed to hold onto a key. We never got any clear answers, and we ended up leaving early because we just didn't feel safe after that. We never went back, and to this day, I still wonder if the owner knew more than he was letting on. I have a friend named Alan who I have known since grade school. After we graduated, Alan went to our local community college while I was doing a carpentry apprenticeship. Alan and I stayed close, and he was one of my only friends. Most of the guys that I worked with were way older, so I didn't have any way to meet new people. Alan, on the other hand, was making a lot of new friends. I had met a few of them on some nights out, and they all seemed pretty cool. One of them was Lenny. He was a quiet guy who was into a lot of the same stuff as me, music and video games mostly. One weekend in the summer, Alan invited me out on a trip that he and some of his new friends were planning. They had booked a cabin on Airbnb. I had met Lenny already, but the other guy, Sam, was a stranger to me. They didn't tell me much about him, but I didn't really question it. He was a normal-looking guy, kind of a surfer bro type of style. He had shoulder-length blonde hair and seemed pretty cool. It was late August, but the days were still warm enough to enjoy being outside. The weather forecast wasn't great, though. There were thunderstorms expected, but that didn't bother us enough to cancel it. They had booked it well in advance, and were really set on the date because it was hard for everyone to agree on it. We left on Friday afternoon and drove out in Alan's car, a small Subaru that was on its last leg. I sat in the front with Alan, and the other two had the back. The old car struggled with the rugged roads a bit, but we arrived at the cabin just before dark. It was a decent-sized place, nothing fancy, but it had everything we needed. The lake was right in front of us, and the place was really scenic. There were other cabins on either side, so it wasn't like we were really isolated. There was a large wooded area leading up to it from the main road, so it kind of gave the illusion that we were in the woods. As we pulled up, I could see the lights on in the neighbor's place, but I didn't see them at all. Once we got settled in, we cracked open a few beers and started to chill out on the back patio. There was a table and chairs out there, and we all positioned them facing the lake. Even though it was August, it was a cold night, so we were all bundled up with sweaters and jackets. I could see my breath in front of me. It was that cold. Sam seemed nice enough, but I noticed pretty quickly that there was something off between him and Lenny. It wasn't obvious in the car, maybe because I was in the front and not paying attention to them. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I figured it was none of my business. Later, Alan mentioned to me that the two of them had some kind of history with a girl back in college. Apparently it had been a bit of a love triangle, and things had never fully gotten resolved between them. Alan said it was old news, but from what I could see, there were still some raw nerves. It wasn't exactly the relaxed vibe we'd all been hoping for, but we tried to keep things light. Later in the evening, it started raining. The misty drops were cold on my skin, and it wasn't long before we all went inside. We decided to spend the night just hanging out in the living room. We were hoping the weather wouldn't get too bad. We turned on some music and played cards for a while. It was fine for the most part, but the tension between Lenny and Sam was hard to ignore. Every once in a while, an argument would break out, but Alan was good at calming them down. The storm really picked up at around midnight. What started as light rain quickly turned into a full-blown downpour. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the power flickered a few times, but somehow it stayed on. We all gathered around the kitchen table, trying to act like everything was normal. Lenny and Sam had been needling each other all night, and it wasn't long before things got ugly. Sam said something to Lenny, then he slammed his cards down and started yelling. Alan tried to step in and calm things down, but it was no use. Lenny wasn't having it. He stood up and grabbed Sam by the hair, then dragged him out of his chair. Sam turned around and started swinging. Lenny had Sam's shirt pulled up over his head, and they were both swinging wildly. I'm sure it would have looked kind of funny, because neither of them knew how to fight. I was worried, though, because I didn't want to see anything bad happen. Eventually, Alan and I were able to separate them, but they were both super pissed, Lenny most of all. Before I knew it, he stormed out of the cabin, slamming the door behind him. What really surprised me was that after Lenny left, I saw his shoes and jacket still sitting there at the front door. He didn't even bother to put them on. That just shows where his head was. We figured he just needed to cool off and would come back in a few minutes. But those minutes turned into half an hour, and then an hour. The storm outside wasn't letting up, and the longer Lenny was gone, the more concerned we became. Alan kept pacing near the window, peering out into the darkness, but all we could see was rain. The wind was so loud that we wouldn't have been able to hear anything, even if Lenny had called out. Eventually, we couldn't just sit there anymore. We grabbed flashlights and went out to look for him. All three of us put on our warmest clothes and stepped out into the raging storm. We were calling his name as we searched around the cabin and by the lake, but he wasn't anywhere to be found. We were soaked through within minutes because the cold rain cut through our clothes, but we kept looking. After a while, we had no choice but to go back inside and call for help. The police were slow to arrive. It was a small remote town, and with the roads flooded from the storm, it took them hours to get out there. By the time they arrived, it was nearly morning. We hadn't slept. Alan was a wreck, pacing the cabin while Sam sat quietly at the table, not saying much. I tried to stay calm, but my mind kept running through worst-case scenarios. When the police finally showed up, they started their search, but it didn't take long. Lenny hadn't gone far from the cabin after all. They found him only a few hundred feet away, near a small slope leading down toward the lake. It looked like he had fallen, hit his head, and had been unable to get up. In the cold and rain, he didn't stand a chance. The officers said it was likely he had become disoriented in the storm and wandered too close to the edge, then slipped on the wet ground. He probably tried to get back up, but between the fall and the exposure to the cold, his body gave out. We answered questions from the police, packed up our things, and left. Alan was devastated, and Sam wasn't much better. I don't think anyone knew what to say. We drove back in near silence and made it back home in the early afternoon. The whole thing felt like the worst nightmare of my life, and I don't think I'll ever get over it completely. I used to live in a basement apartment that was part of an old house. It was a cramped one-bedroom unit, and I had a roommate. I slept on a bed in the living room, which meant my personal space was practically non-existent. My area was curtained off with a bedsheet, but it didn't help that much. It was manageable at first, but the situation got more complicated when I started dating my girlfriend Sarah. She still lived with her parents, so it was hard for us to spend any time alone together. My roommate was a good guy, but he was a pretty serious student, and we weren't really friends. I never even thought to ask him if we could use the room. He paid more in rent, so I had to accept the situation as it was. I couldn't afford not to. One weekend, I decided to do something special for Sarah. I wanted to give her and I a chance to spend time together. I found an Airbnb that seemed perfect. It was a small condo located downtown. The place was a one-bedroom ground-floor condo in a large building. It had a gated patio, but it was open to the public sidewalk. It had a waist-high black metal gate surrounding it, but it would be easy to jump over it if you wanted to. The place was just off a busy street, and the sidewalk got a lot of traffic. I got the place because it was cheap, not that it was the best. We arrived at the condo on a Friday evening. The owner had a lockbox on the outside of the patio, and he messaged us the code. It was easy to get the keys, and we never had to meet anybody. The place was exactly as described on Airbnb. It was little more than a hotel room, really. It only had a partial kitchen. There was a small fridge and a microwave, but no oven. The bedroom was more like a sectioned-off area of the living room, but that was fine, because we had the place to ourselves. The first night went smoothly. We had dinner, watched a movie, did some other stuff, then went to bed. On the second night, everything started off normally. We had gone to bed around midnight after a quiet evening. I fell asleep quickly, but woke up in the middle of the night. At first I wasn't sure what woke me, but then I heard a noise from the main room of the condo. At first I wasn't sure what it was, or if it was actually inside. The nightlife around there was vibrant, so there were still people passing by on the sidewalk. But then, I distinctly heard the creak of a door. I looked over at Sarah, and she was still asleep, although she was tossing and turning. That was when I opened my eyes and saw a man entering the bedroom area. He had a phone in his hand, and he was pointing it towards us. The screen was lighting up his face, and I could see him surprisingly clearly in the dark. He was about 40 years old, with a scraggly beard and glasses. He was wearing a dark beanie with long hair sticking out. He seemed to be taking a picture of me while I was still in bed. I was disoriented and tried to get up right away, but the man quickly left through the doorway and vanished. I heard the patio door open and shut, then I clearly heard it lock behind him. Not automatically. The intruder had to physically lock the door to make that sound. That means that he had a key. I jumped out of bed and turned on the lights, then searched the apartment, but everything looked as it had when we went to bed. Nothing was stolen, even though my laptop was on the table that he would have had to walk right past. I checked the patio door and windows, and they were all locked, and none of them were broken. I called the cops, and they sent some guys over, but it didn't help much. We were still in that apartment, and we knew that there was a crazy guy out there who could get in. After the police left, we took an Uber back to my apartment and spent the night there. In the morning, I called the owner to let him know what was going on. I really just wanted a refund for the stay, because it was pretty obvious that a former guest had made a spare key somehow. I know what you're thinking, and no, it wasn't the owner that broke in. I might have suspected the same, but I got a good look at his face, and it wasn't him. The owner was an older, clean-cut guy in his 60s, and the intruder looked nothing like that. I looked him up on LinkedIn, and I'm sure he was real. I still thought a refund was in order, though, because it is on him to make sure the place is safe. Airbnb agreed, and I got my money back. In all the time since this happened, the person was never caught. The creepiest thing to me is that he was taking pictures of us, and he didn't seem to have any interest in taking our stuff. I keep expecting those pictures to show up online somewhere, but to this day, they've never come up.